Hey everyone, Jamie Batts, Bio 221. This is part 4 of chapter 24, and we left off with just going through some of the basic control mechanisms of the digestive tract, and now your book then goes into some of the mesenteries of your digestive tract. And mesenteries they're kind of abstract because they're three-dimensional, and we tend to just think of everything in like a 2D form because we're looking at our book. But it's important to understand these are the tissues that wrap around and encase all of these organs and protect them and insulate them and support them as well. So the two big ones are the greater and the lesser omentum. And then you have some other kind of sub-mesenteries. They're kind of smaller and a little more strange, I guess. They're not as obvious on a model, for instance. And these are things like the mesocolons and well, the peritoneum. That one's pretty straightforward. That one should be obvious. But the mesocolon and the mesentery proper usually throw off a lot of students. So make sure you take some time to familiarize yourself. I'm not sure how much dissecting you're doing in lab, but if you have a chance to go to the Anatomic Gifts Registry, the Surgical Skills Lab, oh my gosh, you should totally go. It is incredibly amazing. I usually go every single semester, and my schedule just doesn't allow me to do that right now, but it is life-changing. It's awesome. Go, and you'll see all of these mesenteries in real life and get to touch them, and it's just an awesome, awesome experience. So I strongly suggest doing that. So your textbook then goes through, and we kind of start at the top of your digestive system. We start with the mouth. The mouth and the oral cavity are really straightforward. There's really nothing tricky there. Understanding the salivary glands, right? Understanding the teeth could get a little tricky. The anatomy of a tooth, very straightforward. This stuff is pretty much as simple as it gets in A&P 2. There's a chart on page 870 that shows you all of the secretions and the functions. That's a biggie. So either photocopy that chart, kind of bend it in half so that you have two little columns you can study from, or make flashcards of each one would be my suggestion. It does seem like a lot at first, but if you look at them, I mean, you might already be familiar with the function of bile just from everyday life. Maybe you had a gallbladder issue in the past, so you're familiar with it. Or maybe you remember from biochemistry, what the enzyme lactase does, right? So it looks overwhelming at first, but it's pretty straightforward. Nothing's too tricky there. Your book then goes into the swallowing mechanism. The swallowing begins as a voluntary process, right? You're chewing, and then all of a sudden you say, this is mushy enough, I think I'm going to swallow it, right? That's a voluntary thing. You push it to the back, and as soon as it gets over your tongue into the pharyngeal phase, it is now an involuntary process, and your body takes over. You no longer have to think about pushing it back or pushing it down. And that's all diagrammed out for you on page 872, and that pretty much summarizes the oral cavity and everything going on in the mouth. Now we get into the stomach, which is much more complex than the esophagus or the oral cavity. And that's because there's several layers here, and there's a lot of action that takes place in the stomach. First, you have these gastric glands and gastric pits that have all these juices and different types of cells that are secreting different substances. So let's get through some of the big ones. I like to draw because drawing uses a different side of your brain, and it kind of makes you stretch a little bit. So one of the first things to remember about the stomach is that it does have that third muscularis external layer. So not only does it have the longitudinal and the circular, it also has an oblique layer, and that's because the main job of the stomach is to mix up the chyme, as it's called, the food that's been swallowed and mixed with your salivary secretions. It's called chyme, C-H-Y-M-E, and it's going to mix up and really get everything as mixed as possible, and to make sure that if there's any protein in that chyme, that it gets exposed to the hydrochloric acid and the pepsin. So let's talk about some of those things. So here we go. Gastric, we'll just kind of draw like this. It looks like an upside down mitten or Florida or something. This is a gastric pit. Well, the pit itself is the hole. The gland is kind of where all the action happens down below. So the gland is within the pit, if that makes sense. And there's lots of cells that make up this layer. And again, this is all part of that mucosal layer of the stomach, the inner lining of the stomach. And there are special cells, and I'm just abbreviating C and P and G, C, P, C, C, G, P, P, C, right, whatever. They're all around, and they're randomly kind of dispersed. Now, the G, those are the G cells, as they're called. They're secreting gastrin. Gastrin is a hormone that is released by the stomach, and there's a special feedback loop we'll look at later that causes gastrin to be released or to not be released. And basically, it's telling your stomach, get turned on, get moving, let's get all these secretions coming because we're expecting some food. So gastrin's kind of like the pre-gamer, right? Then you have these P cells or parietal cells. Parietal sounds familiar, right? We think of the brain, we think of the lobes of the brain or the bones on the skull. Well, parietal cells in this case are secreting HCl, hydrochloric acid. And then finally, we have C cells or chief cells. These chief cells are secreting pepsinogen. So, what's interesting is the parietal cell actually has carbonic anhydrase inside of it. You might remember carbonic anhydrase from the red blood cells. So let's see. Inside a parietal cell. Inside a parietal cell, you have carbon dioxide and water mixing. And when those things mix, right, just like in the red blood cell, we're going to get, right, carbonic anhydrase is the enzyme there. You're going to get C2H CO3, right? You're going to get carbonic acid, right? So this carbonic acid is going to dissociate, and it's going to form bicarbonate, which is HCO3. Oops, HCO3, sorry. And the hydrogen ion. That hydrogen ion is what's secreted into the lumen of the stomach. It's secreted right here. H+, right? H pluses, now it's hard to see, H pluses are secreted into the lumen there. So these H pluses into lumen are going out. Now, if you remember, there's something called a chloride shift, which I didn't really talk a whole lot about, that happens in the blood cells. Basically, it's exchanging a bicarbonate for a chloride, and then it happens, frontwards and backwards. So this guy is going to go out into the blood, to blood, and guess what? He is being exchanged for chloride. Well, this chloride then goes to the lumen, and guess what? If we have Cl in the lumen and hydrogen in the lumen, that's going to give us HCl. And that HCl is going to activate pepsinogen. And pepsinogen is now pepsin when it's in the presence of HCl. When it is in that very, very low pH in that acidic environment, HCl will activate pepsinogen, which is being released from our chief cells, and pepsin will now be the product. What pepsin does is takes protein and breaks it down into amino acids. Protein to AA, amino acids. So it begins the denaturing of proteins into their basic building blocks so that your body can then use them for whatever it needs, right? And we'll get into digestion eventually, but now we're just looking at the kind of bits and pieces of the whole puzzle. So that's the gist of the stomach. What else do we have going on that I wanted to talk about? Your parietal cells, not only are they releasing hydrochloric acid, they're also releasing something called the intrinsic factor. Just drop my pen cap here. The intrinsic factor is something that's going to assist with vitamin B12 absorption that happens in the large intestine. So again, just to review, the cells here that are within the stomach and those gastric pits. You have the G cells, which are secreting gastrin. Gastrin's there for the mixing and churning. You have the parietal cells, which are releasing hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor is going to help with B12 absorption. And then you have the chief cells. The chief cells, which are releasing the pepsinogen. Pepsinogen is going to be activated by hydrochloric acid in excuse me, to form pepsin so that proteins can be broken down. The chief cells are also responsible for part of the renin-angiotensin system in infants. We haven't talked so much about the renin-angiotensin system yet. We mentioned a little bit with blood pressure regulation. It will come back to haunt us when we do kidneys, but just know that the stomach does play a slight role in the renin-angiotensin system in infants. So that was the gastric glands. Gastric glands are spread all around the stomach. There are special pyloric glands, which are in the pyloric region of the stomach, and these have the G cells also. They also have D cells. These D cells are going to secrete something called somatostatin, and somatostatin inhibits the gastrin. So it's an on-off switch. Just like everything, there's always checks and balances. There's always a way to shut off the switch and kind of return back to normal. And that's what this somatostatin does. There's also in these pyloric glands something called ghrelin that is released. Ghrelin, G-H-R-E-L-I-N, ghrelin. And ghrelin is going to initiate that hunger cue. It's going to make you feel hungry, make your tummy rumble, so to speak. And it's kind of like a little gremlin that lives in your belly that says, feed me. That's ghrelin. Your pyloric glands also secrete mucus, and that mucus is there to coat the inner lining of the stomach mucosa so that the HCl does not damage it. So let's talk about regulation of what goes on in the stomach. Just like everything, there's three ways: local, hormonal, and neural. The local is all done with these little, the hormones and the different signals that are coming, like the ghrelin, the somatostatin, the gastrin. That's that. From the neural perspective, digestion is parasympathetic, so we're talking about the vagus nerve here. And then from an endocrine point of view, ghrelin is it is a hormone that's being released. And you also have some feedback coming from the adrenaline and the acetylcholine that's coming from the adrenal glands. That's going to turn off your hunger cues when you're in that kind of fight or flight response. So there are three phases of gastric activity. The first phase is called the cephalic phase. And in the cephalic phase, the prefix cephal, right, makes you think of the head. That's literally what the first phase of digestion is, or the first phase of gastric activity. It's all in your head. If you're sitting here and maybe it's late at night or early in the morning and you haven't had anything to eat yet, if I start explaining my favorite meal, a big pizza with extra cheese and greasy pepperoni and peppers on it, I don't know, that's not really my favorite, I just made that up. Maybe you like that. And maybe it's making you salivate a little bit. It's waking your stomach up. That is the cephalic phase. It's when you smell popcorn and you want popcorn, right? It's all in your head. That cephalic phase gets your digestive juices rolling in your mouth, Actually, I just swallowed because I'm salivating a little bit just thinking about that. So it's not just in your stomach, it's also the whole digestive process. So all of your pancreatic juices are going to start flowing, your salivary juices are going to start flowing when you start thinking about food. That's the cephalic phase. The second phase is our gastric phase. This is when the food is actually getting to the stomach and that pH is going to decrease. The stomach's going to start stretching, the mucus cells, the G cells, everything starts secreting, and mixing increases, mixing and churning. And then finally you have the intestinal phase of gastric activity, and that's where there's a little reflex loop that goes on that kind of spurts the food into the duodenum, into that first section of the small intestine, and then there are some special hormones that are released at that level. CCK, GIP, secretin, these are all hormones that are released by special cells in the small intestine that provide a feedback to the stomach that says, hey, food's here, you don't have to mix anymore, or it tells the pancreas, hey, we got lots of food here, we need to get some more enzymes in the mix. Right? We'll talk more specifically about those in a little bit. But those are the three levels of kind of gastric activation or gastric activity. So again, it's cephalic, gastric, and intestinal, and it's just about getting the body ready and prepared to digest food. So we'll stop this video here, and then we'll pick up in a minute.